It's just a science project.
Silent breed is people!
You know, a doctor friend once said the same thing to me. Frankenstein was his name.
It's alive! It's alive! It's alive!
That sounds like something out of science fiction.
Please explain to me the scientific nature of the whammy.
We live in a spaceship, dear.
So?
Yes, science!
Program complete. Enter when ready.
Hello and welcome to episode 233 of Science on Top for Sunday the 17th of July 2016. I'm Ed Brown and I'm joined by Dr. Shane Joseph.
Hello.
Penny Dumsday.
Hello.
And Lucas Randall.
Hello.
Well, everyone knows about Australia's Great Barrier Reef, but there's another reef off the coast of Australia that's less famous. Off Western Australia lies an 800-kilometre kelp forest, or at least it did a decade ago, and now the kelp reef is much smaller. To discuss this, we're joined by Dr Scott Bennett from the Spanish National Research Council. Welcome to the show, Scott.
Thank you very much, Ed. Nice to be here.
It's great to have you on, because you've just written a paper all about this in Science Journal, which is really, really interesting. Do you want to give us a brief overview of what's going on with the kelp forest?
Yes, so just to clarify some of the introductory comments. So our study has just...
I always get it wrong.
No, it was close to right. But so, yeah, we've recently published a paper on kelp loss in Western Australia, and we've observed a stretch of coast around 800 kilometres long, but that actually forms part of an even bigger entity known as the Great Southern Reef, which extends over 8,000 kilometres around the southern coastline of Australia, including Tasmania. And this sort of temperate reef ecosystem is dominated by kelp forests and is really consistent throughout that region. So where we've focused on this study is in the southwest coastline of Western Australia. And what we've observed there is that over the past, since 2011, we've had a complete loss of kelp forests, a range contraction of kelp forests along around 100 kilometres of coastline, or about 385 square kilometres. And we've seen large impacts, so not complete loss, but large impacts over a stretch of coast around 800 kilometres.
Wow, so it's a huge amount. How do you know that they've decreased, though? Like, is this a survey that you did 10 years ago or something, and now you do another survey now and you notice the difference? Or how is that sort of tracked?
Yeah, so we've been working on these reefs for the last 15 years, more or less, and we've been going to the same sites each year throughout those 15 years. And part of our work there is surveying the reef. So we survey the seaweed beds, the kelp forest canopies. We sort of survey all the understory seaweeds. We survey the fish, and we survey the invertebrate communities. And we've been doing this consistently. And we've noticed that it's clear as daylight that since 2011, in particular, there's been just fundamental changes in this, and particularly in the kelp cover and the sort of composition of these reef communities.
So I was reading in the conversation article, which is what I picked up the other week from this, which was quite fascinating. That this has also led to a change right across the ecosphere. You've got different fish that are now grazing the reef that are preventing the recovery of the kelp. Is that correct?
Yes, that's right. So all of these changes were largely precipitated by a marine heatwave that we had in 2011. And that heatwave saw really warm conditions over 2.5 degrees above sort of long-term summer maximums occur throughout the southwest coast. And as part of that, we saw a strengthening of the Lewin Current. And the Lewin Current is a boundary current that runs north to south along the West Australian coastline. And it's brought, and with this strong current, it's brought down a lot of tropical species. And so what we've seen is not only this sort of the physiological impact and sort of the retraction of these temperate species, but in their place, we've seen a huge increase in tropical species onto these reefs. And so we've seen a complete change in community composition from something that looked like a temperate kelp forest from southern Australia to now something that more closely resembles a coral reef ecosystem. Well, in terms of the fish and the seaweeds, that looks more like tropical reefs that we'd see up around Ningaloo or even the Great Barrier Reef, for example. And one of the major contributors to this change in fish community composition are some of the herbivorous fish, like our parrotfish and rabbitfish and surgeonfish. And these species have increased in abundance a lot and are now grazing on the new sort of very small turf-dominated state that we see on these reefs. And due to their really high grazing rates, they're preventing sort of the recruitment or settlement of any kelps that might be coming back onto the reef, and they're maintaining this really cropped short turfs that we see on the reefs now.
So I take it there's quite an impact expected then on fisheries and the species that are typically fished around that region. Is there something that's being noticed by industry already?
Yes, so there were huge impacts to the abalone fishery up around Kalbarri, this Midwest region that was most significantly hit. That heat wave completely wiped out the abalone from the region, which were quite an important fishery. The rock lobster, I'm unaware of any major changes to that fishery. This fishery has sort of a 4 to 5 year lag time between sort of due to the life cycle of the species from when you would see an impact to when you might expect to start seeing some repercussions. So if there have been sort of those hytrophic implications on the rock lobster, then we'd expect to start seeing them from now on. But so far, I can't say if there's been any major impacts there. There have certainly been big impacts to fishing, so reef fishes, and this has been most notably noticed by the recreational anglers in particular, which sort of probably have the biggest fishing presence on these reefs. And that's largely that they're now catching a lot of tropical species that they've never caught before. So in their eyes, there's actually some quite positives to take out of this, because they're landing some beautiful big tropical fishes on these reefs. But yeah, a lot of the generally smaller, less targeted temperate species, those that are more dependent on the kelp canopy in particular, have disappeared. But once again, they're sort of generally less targeted by these recreational fishermen. So there's a mix of impacts.
Yeah.
Is there an expectation that the trend will continue in the same direction, and we'll see more of these tropical species moving further and further south?
We anticipate that to be the case, and primarily because, again, of this strong Lewin current, the poleward flow of this. When we get these warmer years and sort of this increased flow, it sort of facilitates that poleward movement of tropical species. And this is set on a background warming trend in the region, and the marine coastal environment of southwestern Australia has warmed at around 2 times faster than the global average rate of warming. So warming quite quickly, and these extreme events are also forecast to sort of increase in intensity and things over the coming years. So we expect that this trend of extreme events, warming, it helps the tropical species moving down the coast, and unfortunately really impedes the potential recovery prospects of the temperate species from moving back up.
What I find quite fascinating and also very disheartening about this is that 2 degrees is not what I would consider a huge temperature change, and yet that has had the effect of wiping out 300 square kilometres of kelp forest, or more than that. Sorry, and I find that fascinating as a fact, but also it's almost like a little microcosm of what is happening globally and what will happen as temperatures rise. And that's I just find that kind of scary, to be honest.
That was just a huge shock to us as well. I mean, if you think on land, for example, a 2 degree, heat wave or something seems like it would be quite tolerable to most organisms and things. But I mean, that's where the marine environment, in a way, is ultra sensitive, just because particularly southwestern, or particularly the south coast of Australia along the Great Southern Reef, this system has evolved basically for over 20 million years with a really stable sort of climatic environment. There's fairly little fluctuation. We see temperature fluctuations of only 5 or 6 degrees annually. And of course, throughout the day, temperatures are relatively stable. So these things have evolved and adapted to a really stable environment. And that's what shocked us as well. You only have to push these things by a little bit and you see these catastrophic impacts.
Yeah. I mean, that wasn't helped by also the changing current, like you said. It was almost like a perfect storm of events to essentially change the entire face of this seascape, basically.
And Shane mentioned the global impact that we're seeing, particularly with the Great Barrier Reef. Do you know if anything has happened from that 2011 heat wave? Is there anything happening with the Great Barrier Reef that's linked to that, or is that just a separate thing to do with all the other acidification and that sort of stuff?
No, yeah, you're right. There is really strong parallels between what's happened to the Great Barrier Reef and many tropical coral reefs around the world this year, and the heat wave in 2011. The difference is so now we've entered back into an El Nino phase, and El Nino, when we get really strong El Ninos like we've witnessed this year, that makes really sort of hot, dry conditions on the east coast of Australia, and sort of the north coast of Australia, and that's led to the coral bleaching that we've seen on the Great Barrier Reef. It's devastated the Great Barrier Reef this year. In southwestern Australia, it actually works the other way around. So when we get these strong El Ninos like this year, we enter sort of a slightly cooler phase in southwestern Australia, and in fact, it's the La Nina, strong La Ninas, which sort of go out of sync with the El Ninos that provide the hot conditions. So when we get it, when southwestern Australia gets it really hot, northeastern Australia and eastern Australia gets it sort of cooler and wetter, and vice versa.
Yeah, I think linking back to what Shane was saying before, the really stunning thing, in the last 12 months is we're used to increasingly dire predictions as to global warming impacts, but this year it seems to me, particularly in Australia, with both of these events, the coral bleach in the Barrier Reef and the kelp reefs in the west, we've seen such significant changes in such a really short period of time. And as you say, there's a bit of a lag effect involved here as well, because we're going back to an event that really took place in 2011, but it's still quite stunning to see in action, real strong evidence of exactly what they've been warning about. The scientists have been warning about for quite some time, that we will see significant changes in the seascape. We'll see significant species changes, migrations of species, and impact on right across the a very delicate ecosystem, and we're definitely seeing that now.
Yeah, it's frightening, isn't it? Like, it's completely changed my perspective, or observing this firsthand has really changed my perspective and appreciation of just how serious this is, because often you hear about these predictions or projections for climate change maybe out to 2100 or even 2020, and it always just seems like something will happen out in the future, but we don't have to worry about it yet. It's not sort of impacting us our lives yet. But then just seeing how just quickly and just devastatingly these things can happen just makes you realise that we're living this now, and this is only it's heading in one direction, unfortunately, at the moment.
Yeah. That's very much human nature, isn't it? We don't worry about the things that we can't tangibly see right here, right now. If it's off in the future, we tend to give it less importance. But now we are actually seeing the effects. And it's very doom and gloom. Is there any hope? Is there anything that we can do about it apart from reversing climate change? But is there anything that we can do here, or is it all dire straits?
Can we all go and plant kelp?
Yeah, it's a great question. It's one we've been sort of toying with a little bit. So obviously, like broadly, generally speaking, like you say, there are things we can do. Reducing CO2 emissions obviously is of the most importance. But there's a strong time lag on that, and that requires global action. If we want to look sort of more locally, short term or short medium term things we can do now, then reducing other stresses, other pressures is probably one of the most important ways of sort of preventing further losses, further impacts. And these things, quite similar to like we're hearing a lot about from the Great Barrier Reef as well, reducing those sort of urban sort of wastewater runoff, eutrophication of our reefs, because this has a huge impact on the health of these ecosystems as well. And when you get these sort of compounding impacts, then it has sort of really severe effects. In the southeastern Great Southern Reef, they've noticed that sort of overfishing of their rock lobster, for instance, has a huge interacts with climate change in a really important way, and sort of can really reduce the resilience of those reefs to climate change. So good fisheries management, minimising coastal runoff and these sorts of things, really important. In terms of the rehabilitation or sort of revegetating some of these kelp forests, I think there's complications involved with it. So there's groups in Sydney that are doing fantastic work about revegetating some of the seaweed forests that have been lost around Sydney. And that's great because they don't have to take these species from far. They're sort of coming from a similar climatic situation, and they're sort of situated, and the stressor basically that caused those seaweeds to be lost initially has been abated. In the case of these sort of broad geographical or climate-driven changes, to move species back up, to move kelps back up to these reefs, sort of assumes that, is sort of dependent on them being tolerant of the conditions at these reefs. And we're finding a lot of local adaptation, and a lot of the southern populations aren't actually tolerant of the conditions that are experienced on those northern reefs, for one. And the other thing is just a scaling matter. So we actually did try and transplant some kelps back up onto these reefs to see what would happen and see if we could get them to survive. And these tropical fishes that I talked to you about, they ate sort of around 50 kilograms of kelp within 2 days. So everything we could put back on the reef, they just ate it within just a couple of days. So
wow. There's
a real scaling issue here as well. If you want to transplant stuff back onto those reefs, it needs to be in huge quantities to sort of, outproduce the consumption rates of these herbivores.
So with the heat wave that came, like, is it as far as I'm trying to imagine this in my head, the increase of 2 degrees, was it bringing the fish that caused the kelp to die off, or was it the kelp couldn't survive the 2 degrees, or was it both?
Great question. So in this instance, it was primarily that these temperatures surpassed the physiological sort of tolerance limits of these kelps. So it was that sort of just direct heat stress of on the kelps that killed them. But then sort of the increase in abundance of herbivores sort of reinforced that loss. So, they then also increased in abundance, and then all their sort of high grazing rates prevented these to increase. They have we looked a bit at whether this increase in herbivores could have actually caused this kelp loss as well, but we found no evidence that could be the case. They sort of, compared to because these kelp forests are hugely productive, and these systems that were there before are hugely productive, already supported really large populations of herbivores. But obviously, productivity was greater than these fish could consume. So, there was no net change there. It was just when we got this huge physiological shock, knocked out a whole bunch of kelp, and then all of a sudden, plus an extra increase in herbivores, these things just went wild.
And of course, in trials, there's no way you can mimic that same level of productivity with transplanting kelp. Like, you can only really sort of put a little bit of what was already there. So
that's right. Yeah,
anyway, so I'm just thinking of that. Yeah,
scaling limitation there. We just can't put out hectares at a time.
No.
Scott, it's a fascinating topic and a really interesting paper. Thank you very much for joining us on the show today. I know I'm going to be singing Rock Lobster for the rest of the day, and maybe our audience will be as well. But Thank you very much for joining us.
Thank you guys. Yeah, it's great talking to you.
Thanks, Scott.
Yeah, we're really grateful to Dr. Scott Bennett from the Spanish National Research Council. It's a really fascinating study. But let's move on. And a new study has found that capuchin monkeys in Brazil have been using stones as tools to prepare their favourite meal for more than 700 years. Penny, do you want to tell us about the cashew processing sites?
Yeah, so they're not actually what you imagine if you think of a processing site. It's not so much a factory, but more a collection of stones. So these monkeys are getting a really heavy kind of anvil stone and picking up a stone, again, quite a heavy stone to use as a hammer, and putting the nut on the anvil, smashing it with the hammer. That sound effect you might have heard was me just doing a bit of an enactment of that, and opening it up and getting the nut out of the shell. And I found this really interesting because I've never really thought about non-human archaeology, but apparently chimpanzees, evidence of chimpanzee tool use has been found, I think, a few thousand years old. And this recent study shows that monkeys have been using stones as tools for at least 700 years. And my first thought was, well, they're not sitting there like our ancestors did, and carving them into intricate, undeniably manufactured tools. So how do you know? But it turns out that cashew nuts in particular have an oil in it that will stain the stone.
Oh, of course.
So you can tell it's been repeatedly used
Very cool.
for this purpose. And because there's monkeys in the area doing it now, it seems reasonable to infer that it was monkeys doing it 700 years ago.
Yeah, like you say, it wouldn't surprise me if this was chimpanzees or other, sort of great apes or something, but just little monkeys is unexpected, I guess. Even though we've seen lots of animals use tools.
That's what surprised
we've seen
me too.
fish and crows.
Yeah, I think, didn't we do one about dolphins using sponges for something?
Yeah, I can't remember either.
Yeah, it was,
but we've seen magpies, for example, use tools and hooks and things.
Yeah, and crows.
Yeah.
Ravens.
So, and because I studied archaeology at uni a little bit, and I never thought about the archaeology of animal behaviour or just studying animals in isolation from humans. Like the only reason, and it was just one of those assumptions that you would study animals to see how humans were using them or blah, 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 or fighting them or eating them or something. But I love the idea of animal archaeology and finding out more about how animals do this. And it's just also, again, that fascinating thing about how tool use in primates comes around. Like, is it learned or is it genetic, and what's the interplay between those two factors? I mean, 700 years is quite a long time for a tradition to persist. It's a lot of generations of monkeys. And
it's also, that social structure obviously means that one generation can teach the next generation, and it's not something that each individual discovers on its own type thing. So
it has to figure out. Yeah.
And there's also obviously the link to us. When did our common ancestors, start doing the same thing?
Yeah, exactly.
But also this story was talking about the different shape and size of the stones that they were using, and it creates distinctive patterns on the pounding, which is also cool. As you say, it wasn't so much that they chiseled the stones necessarily into shape, but presumably they found ones that were of an appropriate shape and size for bashing against.
In a way, if that's all you're trying to do, a lot more efficient to find one that's the right shape and leave it in an area and then someone else comes along and use it than actually try and make it.
Yeah. Well, I mean, what I like about this as well is that there's basically these monkeys recognise this idea of and do recognise the idea of, well, this is the place where we do this.
Yeah.
And these are the tools we do it with. It's not just, I've got to break this nut open, I'm going to find this random rock and this random other bigger rock. It's like, no, this is the place
this is where we
it sort of
leave
suggests like a ritual or almost like, not a ritual, but like a
learned behaviour. Yeah.
Procedure, a recipe almost.
Procedure, yeah. And it's quite cool, really.
I also love the thought from when Penny said animal archaeology. I was picturing like monkeys dressed as Indiana Jones.
I knew that was where you're going to go with that.
It was just you, but now it's me as well. So I'm enjoying it. Very cool. Now, researchers at the Stanford University School of Medicine have made a pretty big discovery that could determine whether a patient has a bacterial infection or a viral infection by doing a pretty simple blood test and looking at the expression of just 7 genes. Shane, obviously we've talked before about the problems of antibiotic resistance and people taking antibiotics in a futile attempt to fight viral infections. So this could be a really useful tool.
Yeah, and the reason it is a useful tool is because we've sort of, there's a sort of impression in the media that people are rampantly using antibiotics for things like the cold virus, and obviously antibiotics are antibacterial and therefore they have no effect against the virus, and that's true. And we assume it's very irresponsible, but the problem is that apparently when you first, say you walk into a doctor's office and you have a really severe infection, or you're a patient in the hospital and you're sick. At first, it might not necessarily be apparent if you've got a viral or a bacterial infection. And the problem is that doctors will usually give you antibiotics because they can see that you're in dire straits and they need to do something. And usually, it's like a 50-50 sort of chance here. Is it bacterial? Is it viral? At least if you give them antibiotics immediately and it works, at least then they're alive. Now,
it's as much a diagnostic tool in itself. If you give them antibiotics and they improve, you know that it's a bacterial infection. If they don't, must be viral. Exactly.
But the problem is that if you then take away that sort of diagnostic tool, as you say, people could also die. Because you're sitting there doing testing. Is it viral? Is it bacterial? I don't want to give them antibiotics in case, and then all of a sudden your patient is dead. So it's a bit of a conundrum, really. So we know that bacterial and viral infections have very different effects on your gene expression. The problem is that in the past, the only way to look at this is by looking at a battery of like hundreds of genes using what's called microarrays, which is very like looking at gene expression amongst a whole swathe of genes, and this takes a very, very long time. And obviously in a clinical setting, this is just not viable. So these researchers have come up with this idea of, they basically did meta-studies, and they looked at the different gene expressions of most viral infections compared to most bacterial infections, and they found that there are 7 genes that will tell you either way if it's a bacterial or a viral infection. Now, I'm not actually sure what kind of test this is. I've been trying to figure it out, and I don't know what it is. I'm guessing it's a PCR, like a DNA amplification test where they look for a certain target. Now, even so, that you still want to make sure that this is actually a fast enough test to make it suitable in a diagnostic setting. Because obviously if it takes a couple of hours, this could be crucial for the patient determining whether or not you give them antibiotics or not. But the idea that we could use this as a diagnostic tool in conjunction with lessening the use of antibiotics is a quite attractive one. So I just hope they manage to they get to a point where this can actually be used in a diagnostic setting. Now they've looked at some of the numbers, and apparently the test is about 98% accurate.
That's pretty damn good.
It's pretty good. It's pretty good.
Incredibly accurate, really.
Yeah, it is. And apparently this is also been. I think this is like a joint country study. Like this is not just Stanford University, but I think this is also in conjunction with the study that was done in Nepal.
Okay.
So it's
but it is some time away from actually being able to be implemented. It's the sort of thing where it still gives you a result it takes 4 to 6 hours, and obviously if someone's being admitted into a hospital, then you probably want an answer in an hour or less, because it's just an exponential increase in the risk of death for every hour, sort of thing.
Exactly, yeah.
And also, I suspect that it's I don't know if maybe cost is probably not so much an issue, actually, given the rapid decline in the cost of gene testing.
Well, but that being said, antibiotics are still much, much cheaper. So, they do want to get it to a stage where it's actually cost effective to administer this test as opposed to just giving their patient heaps of antibiotics. I mean, in some ways, I'd like it to get to this stage because when you sort of give a patient antibiotics, I mean, I think as a doctor you probably have some idea of what it might be, and so you'll give you'll give antibiotics accordingly. But at the same time, it's still a guess. An educated guess, yes, but it's still a guess. Whereas with this test, if you've got, and apparently there's like a 2-tier test they can probably do, where they have a test where they look at 11 genes, which tells you if you've got an infection at all, and this one which tells you if it's viral or bacterial. So if you do that at the same time, it's an even more powerful diagnostic tool. The problem is, of course, there's the time that it takes to do these tests. And 4 to 6 hours in a clinical setting, I think, especially with someone who's presenting with a really horrible infection or some horrible illness, is probably way too long to be used diagnostically. But yeah, it's still early days, and the point is that they could develop this to a stage where it is very, very quick.
I think that if you're in an emergency setting with really serious infection, then maybe this isn't the answer yet because of the time it takes to do it. But if you walk into a GP and you've got cold or flu symptoms or whatever, and it might be a bacterial infection, like a lung infection, or it could be a viral infection or a bacterial lung infection. If you could, then get tests done overnight, pathology or whatever, you come back the next day and you've got the right drugs for it. That could be maybe where this is headed, in the short term at least.
Yeah. It does mean you're sicker for a bit longer, and you potentially you're sicker for a bit longer.
That's true.
And
potentially infectious.
Yeah, and you'll be miserable for 12 hours and infectious. So it has its ups and downs here. So I think that the main thing, as far as I can see, is making this test really, really quick. And I'm not really sure. Again, I'm not sure how they're doing this. I'm not sure if it's a PCR test or if it's like a some sort of a colorimetric test. I don't know. But if it can be quicker, I think that would always be better. And as long as it retains the accuracy by becoming faster, then yeah, it'd be very useful.
Okay, Lucas, the problem of space junk is a very real one, and we've all seen gravity. We know what can happen if satellites or space stations crash into debris. And there's a lot of disused and broken down satellites in low Earth orbit that are a real risk. Well, the European Space Agency has a cunning plan to remove a derelict satellite by 2023, possibly with a giant fishing net. Is that right?
Yes, that's one of the approaches that's being considered. There's actually two approaches being considered. One is to use a robotic arm to grab a hold of the satellite and basically drag it down to a deorbiting level where it can be basically thrown towards the Earth. Or the other option is to send out basically, as you said, a fishing net sort of approach where they can capture it in a net, and that's probably more likely to be the approach, to be honest, because one of the biggest challenges with this is with satellites such as this, they're typically in a tumbling sort of attitude, so trying to grab onto them with something would require a great deal of precision and a lot of control, and because it's we're talking up to 2,000 kilometers above the Earth here. For low Earth orbit, this is a real challenge for something to be controlled in real time. So you can imagine the how advanced the computer would have to be in order to do this automatically and to match.
It'd have to be autonomous. You couldn't do this from ground or anything.
It'd be very, very difficult, but doing it autonomously would also be extremely difficult just to match something that would be tumbling like that. So the net is one of the approaches that they're strongly considering, and I think it'll probably end up going in that direction. But it's a real issue. We've covered this before, and certainly listeners may remember the Chinese launch a number of years ago, back in 2007, where there was the Chinese actually intentionally destroyed a weather satellite. As a part of an anti-satellite program that they had to show that they could take out military purpose satellites and so forth. So that test has caused a massive debris field, which is a real problem because you've got lots of pieces that are of varying sizes hurtling through space at very, very fast speeds. Up to 7 kilometers a second. So anything even as size of as they often quote a speck of paint, like a fleck of paint, hurtling at that speed could do fairly significant damage to other spacecraft and satellites and so forth. So
the ESA said that a 1 centimeter sized piece of space debris could strike a working satellite with the force of a hand grenade. So that's incredible, really. But also, I think it's interesting that this is going for the larger items and not, these clouds of specks and smaller items. Because, of course, if you have a big satellite and it hits another big satellite, you get lots of little bits of satellite, and you add to that problem of the smaller debris field. So this is like taking out the low-hanging fruit kind of thing, which will be better in the long run.
Yeah. Because there's a huge amount of junk up there that's decommissioned satellites that have passed their use by date or have just failed, and often they're left more or less in an orbit because it's very expensive to launch fuel up to space. So launching fuel expressly for the purpose of deorbiting a satellite is not something that's typically been in the business case. So there's a lot of satellites up there that are not operational anymore, that are still orbiting. And in fact, a few years ago, I think about 2009, there was a Russian satellite hit one of the Iridium satellites, which basically caused a massive explosion of the two satellites and spread quite a large debris field. So now they estimate that there's well over 21,000 pieces of space trash that are larger than about 10 centimeters. Over 500,000 pieces that are smaller than that, and if you're getting down to sort of nano size, they're talking in the trillions of pieces. Now they're spread in 3 different layers, based on where the different orbits are. You've got low Earth orbit, which is sort of up to anywhere between 200 and 2,000 sort of kilometers, which is where where we tend to put things that are easy to get to space. This is where your space station is and so forth. But there's also where your weather satellites are and that sort of thing, which are higher up again and going right out to the geosynchronous orbits, which are sort of around the 22,000 miles and above, 36,000 kilometers. So all of them have got this issue, and they've all becoming more and more of a problem for spacefaring species like us, where we're sending more and more out there. And it's becoming something that we actually actively have to do something about. So this mission that's been proposed by ESA, the European Space Agency, is basically the first of its kind. It's of the class of spacecraft that's being known as a space tug. It's basically a satellite that's being used to tug other ones around and to move them around in orbit. And I think the purpose of this mission really is a proof of concept, as often governments get involved with proof of concept sort of missions, which could lead to commercial application of this. And I can certainly see a time in the future where the various agencies and even commercial entities that are launching satellites and other spacecraft, basically at the end of the missions of those things, they pay other commercial entities to go and clean up for them.
Well, let's hope that happens. I really hope it's a success. Also, I guess the advantage of this is it doesn't have to be a big spacecraft. It just has to be something small that can then shoot out, a Spider-Man fishing net type thing and then lower it down. So it could end up being fairly economical as well.
Well, yeah, if they can get to a point that they've got reusable ones as well.
Yeah.
That could be very
definitely
cool.
All right, I think that's our show. All the links, of course, will be in the show notes and on the website at scienceontop.com/234. You can also leave a comment there or find our social media links. And don't forget, you can send an email to feedback@scienceontop.com, and a review on iTunes would help us get the word out. We'd appreciate that. Lucas, Penny, Shane, thanks a lot for joining me today.
Thank you.
No worries.
And we'll have some contact details as well for Dr. Scott Bennett. I'm very grateful for his really interesting interview earlier today. This episode was edited with versatility and courage by Marcos Benemu. Thank you everyone for listening. We'll be back again next week, putting science on top of the agenda. Join us then.
Last month, some 2,500 of the world's coral reef experts met in Hawaii and agreed to send a letter to Prime Minister Malcolm Turnbull warning him that
coral reefs are threatened with complete collapse under rapid climate change.
That letter was widely reported by the Australian media. But, surprise, surprise, one place you couldn't read it was in The Australian, whose environment editor Graham Lloyd has written several recent stories suggesting coral bleaching ain't as bad as many have claimed. Graham Lloyd's latest article on the subject, which appeared just as the Hawaii Symposium ended, was headlined
Great Barrier Battleground,
with a subtitle to explain that
the bleaching of parts of the reef is dividing the scientific world.
One of the two people telling Lloyd that the barrier reef will repair itself is an American biologist called Jim Steele. So, is he regarded as an expert on coral? Answer no. Is he known to be an expert on oceans? No again. So is he a famous climate scientist? No, he is not. Indeed, when we asked Professor Gates about him, she told us,
I don't know who this person is, and if they were anyone serious in the field, I should know them.
A little bit of digging reveals that Jim Steele is ex-director of the Sierra Nevada Field Campus of San Francisco State University, where, according to his biography,
he has taught the world of plants, nature study, natural sciences for teachers, bird banding, and bird identification by song classes.